Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our briefing, What's on the Table for the Negotiations. This is the first of 3 briefings this week in our series, What Congress Needs to Know About COP30. I'm Dan Brissett. I'm the president of the Environmental and Energy Study Institute. EESI was founded by a bipartisan group of members of Congress, and since 1984, we have worked to provide information about environmental, energy, and climate change topics to policymakers and the public. We do our best to ensure that our resources are always timely, relevant, accessible, and practical, and we try to make sure that they are ready before congressional staff even know they need the information, which is why we're doing this briefing today, because it's just in the nick of time. The best way to keep up with everything we do at EESI is to subscribe to our bi-weekly newsletter, Climate Change Solutions. The latest issue just came out like 31 minutes ago. So if you missed it today, you can read it on the website, but it's not too late at all to subscribe for the next issue, which will actually be a little bit delayed because of our other newsletter, COP30 Dispatch. I'll talk about that in just a moment. You should also follow us on social media at EESI Online, on Blue Sky and on Instagram, and that way you never miss out on any of our briefings or other resources. For the past few years, EESI has produced intensive coverage of the international climate negotiations that take place every November to make progress toward global commitments to the Paris Agreement. These negotiations, this year's COP30 and several days of ancillary meetings, will start on Monday in Brazil. A major change this year will be a lack of an official U.S. federal administration presence at the negotiations. And in response, we expect states and local governments and businesses, as well as members of Congress, to try to make up for that lack of U.S. leadership. For most policymakers, COP30 comes and goes. It appears in daily headlines for 2 or so weeks, and then it fades out of news cycles. But in fact, this is a year-round business and a lot to keep up with. For our congressional staff, our resources are designed to help you get up to speed quickly, just in time for the negotiations, and then keep track of who is doing and saying what. So in addition to briefings like today, we'll also publish a daily newsletter, COP30 Dispatch, and produce trackers and articles to monitor developments. Speaking of briefings, though, we'll host 3 online-only briefings on successive days starting today. Today is about the negotiations and possible outcomes. Tomorrow will be about the Global Cooling Pledge. And Thursday will be about international trade and climate policy. You're not going to want to miss any of them because they'll help you answer questions from your boss, who will also be reading the news about COP30, about what is happening in Brazil, even without that official U.S. federal administration presence. COP30 Dispatch and Climate Change Solutions are available to subscribe to at eesi.org, as well as everything else. You can watch all of our videos and read our articles and read our fact sheets, and everything is accessible and available on our website. Very briefly, this is a link to a survey. We'll also put this up at the end of the briefing. If you have any comments about the briefing today or any issues or any ideas for future topics, please let us know. We read every response, and we really appreciate the time that everyone takes to submit survey responses. We have 2 extraordinary panelists today, and thankfully we'll have time with them to ask questions. If you'd like to ask us questions, you can follow us on social media at EESI Online. We'll be doing real-time coverage on Blue Sky and Instagram. If you'd like to be attributed, have your question attributed to you, at least behind the scenes attributed, you can send us an email, and the email address to use is ask, that's ask@eesi.org. But we will also be collecting anonymous questions using Mentimeter. You can scan this QR code or visit menti.com and use the 8-digit code to access an online form to submit questions. We'll do our best to incorporate your questions, whether it's through social media or the email address or the Mentimeter, into the Q&A after the panel. So without further ado, let me introduce the first of our 2 panelists today. Tracy Bach is a law professor who has taught and published on climate change, international environmental law and human rights, and healthcare and environmental health law. At the Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth College, Tracy teaches a practicum course that prepares its delegations of MBA students for private sector engagement at COPs. At the University of Miami, she teaches an intensive COP engagement course for law students who provide negotiation support to low-lying island states. Tracy is an active member of the Research and Independent Non-Governmental Organization Steering Committee, that's RINGO, and she served as the RINGO constituency co-focal point from 2017 to 2024. Tracy, it is always so nice to welcome you to one of our briefings. Thank you for making time once again during this very busy week to join us. I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Dan. Looking forward to being here again this year. I really appreciate the welcome back. Well, my role is to get you situated, at COP30, which will take place in Belém, Brazil, And when I say will take place, I think Dan's reference to Nick at Time News is that, in fact, the venue's open this week, and that a host of, in particular, developing country delegations are there coordinating in their negotiating groups. So COP, though, in theory, really kicks off with the opening plenary next Monday. There's, in fact, a leaders summit taking place. So those are heads of state and heads of government that are convening at the end of this week on Thursday and Friday. But I think fundamentally, I want to get 2 points established at the get-go. And one, I think, is encapsulated well by a Portuguese word that I cannot pronounce, but that the presidency is using regularly. I'm going to call it mutirão. And what this means to them is that the COP for them is this continuous method of mobilizing. They say mobilization, and it starts before the COP, it extends through the COP, and continues after the COP. And this is their idea of mobilizing not just other countries in the world, but people in their own country and people around the world. I mention that because one of the things Dan said about this process in his introduction is that it is a year-round endeavor. And many people don't understand, because we focus on the COP presidency this year, Brazil, that in fact, this is the presidency-elect. And the Azerbaijani government is still the presidency from COP29 until next Monday, when at a certain point in the plenary, the new COP presidency, the COP30 presidency, is gavelled in. Why is that important? Well, one, there's always transitions from year to year. But two, what often isn't apparent is how much is going on throughout the year. So in fact, at the end of this COP, hopefully the 21st, but we'll have a little pool to predict whether it's the 22nd or the 23rd or the wee hours of the 24th. But we'll have a set of decisions that presidency then feels empowered to take throughout the rest of the year, to the point where it hands off to the next presidency. Okay, so last thing on this slide, COP is not just a COP. We always say it, but it's actually about 5 different meetings. So it's the Conference of the Parties of those who have ratified the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which we call the UNFCCC. It's also the 20th Conference of the Parties of the Meeting of the Parties of the Kyoto Protocol ratifiers, those countries. And then finally, the one that I think most of us who are here today are focused on is the Paris Agreement. And so the CMA 7, the 3rd meeting that's taking place, is the 7th meeting of the countries that ratified the Paris Agreement. Then SBSTA and SBI. Let me address that in the next slide. Dan, can you go to the next one? Dan O. So I mentioned these different COPs, right? But what are they? For me, I think of them as kind of a legislative body. And what they do is they meet every year as a plenary body, like a Congress. And they refine the treaty language and obligations. So they're always interpreting the treaty language. So that's why there's a COP for each of these treaties that you can see on this slide that were adopted, signed, and ratified by countries and then entered into force over time. So I hope this schema gives you that picture, why there are these 3 COPs, if you will, going on. Next slide. I think this captures the essence of the year-round activity. Apologies, that looks small to me. Hopefully it looks bigger to you all on the screen. I'm putting this up here because at the top in my color coding, I had the good fortune to work with a grad student to create this schema. You'll see the different treaties. So the UNFCCC, the Kyoto Protocol, and the Paris Agreement at the top. And those are the ones that have the different COPs. But right underneath it are 2 main subsidiary bodies. And getting back to my legislature analogy, that's now like the committee level, whether it was in the House or the Senate, but it's the committee level, the workhorses of developing policy that will be translated into the COP decisions. And those are the SBI, which is the subsidiary body for implementation, and SBSTA, which is the subsidiary body for science and technical, I think it's advice is the last day. And those meetings, if we go to the next slide, you'll see, are what happened primarily in the first week. So we call it a COP. We're calling it COP30. But in fact, for the first week, next week, the 10th through, is that the 16th probably, that Saturday? No, the 15th, that Saturday, that's when the SBs will do their work. They always have an intersessional meeting. So we were all in Bonn, while just the subsidiary bodies are the workhorses to actually say, so, okay, so what is loss and damage? And how much should go into that fund? And what's the basis for it? And they tee up that kind of more technical knowledge and the refining of it for an eventual plenary decision by a COP. So that's what's happening mostly the first week. There are also other mandated events, and I'll leave it at that. The second week is a big shift. That's when there'll be another high-level segment, so to complement the summit that's going on at the end of this week, where heads of state and heads of government will come in. And their role at that point is to begin, if you will, the horse trading between different areas of negotiation. And we'll get to that, adaptation versus mitigation versus finance. And this is where they come in and they don't take over their delegations, but they work with their heads of delegations to open up, if you will, their remits, to make red lines become a little more orange or yellow, or maybe eventually green. There's also a lot going on in the space outside of the negotiations, both weeks, with side events, which are events that try to bring information to the table and teach people, more like a conference kind of panel. And then also pavilions and other activities. Let me go to the next slide then. So I would like to have us focus for the next two slides on the Paris Agreement. Why? Because one, as you saw maybe on, I think it was slide 2, it came into effect, entry into force, wicked fast. There is a lot of attention to it because it presented a new paradigm, we think of in international treaty law, for this multilateral environmental agreement. Why? How? Well, this World Resources Institute, I think Graphic does a nice job. Fundamentally, the treaty architecture of the Paris Agreement says you shall, as a country, if you ratify this treaty, you shall submit what's called an NDC, or a nationally determined contribution. What is that? Well, it's a contribution both in terms of mitigation, it could be an adaptation and finance and technical advice and capacity building, but fundamentally in mitigation. And it's what each country signs up to do per their ability under this principle called common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capacities. So you have to do that if you're going to live up to the Paris Agreement that you ratified. 2, you have to report progress on it. And that's not as clear, I think, on this graphic. But if we look at like 2020, I think we'll go with 20, I can't actually see it so well. I have to look at my own slide here. But if we think about the NDCs, which some people would call NDC2s, you know, from 2020, then what happens is that each country, after they file their nationally determined contribution, like the US's, for example, under the Biden administration, I think 50 to 52% reduction off a 2005 baseline, I think by 2035, right? So very clear, it's not in a particular sector. And the mitigation is of greenhouse gases, the 6 ones that are governed by the UNFCCC. Next stop, you have to file now a BTR, a biennial transparency report. What does that do? That tells the world the progress or not that you're making on your nationally determined contributions. They're required, they're a shall requirement every 2 years. They're filed with the UNFCCC Secretariat, and they are public and are accessed. Third, the third major part of what's called the ambition mechanism of the Paris Agreement is this thing, this acronym called the GST, which is the global stocktake. Okay, so ready? Your country ratifies the Paris Agreement, you file your NDC, like the one I just mentioned that was posed by the Biden administration. Then within 2 years, you file a biennial transparency report that says what you have done and what you have measured in terms of your progress. Third, so that should be individual accountability, right? Because it's just on your NDCs. But the GST is really different. It's intended to be an accountability mechanism where all parties at the COP and at these bond meetings that are called intersessionals gather and review not just their own data, but data from different subsidiary bodies, data from the IPCC, data from, you name it, right? To look at how are we performing not on our individual NDCs, but how are all parties performing on their individual NDCs relative to achieving the real goal, which is articulated under Article 2 of the Paris Agreement of being, quote, well below 2C from pre-industrial temperatures and striving basically to keep to 1.5. So that's the architecture of the Paris Agreement. And so if we go to the next slide, you can see in this slide, but going into it, that one of Brazil's obligations this year is to draw attention to the new NDCs that were required to be filed this year. And I say that with a little bit of stutter, because technically, as you'll see, I think I put it on the slide. Yeah, I mean, they were doing, I think I took it off so as not to shame anybody, but they were due February 10th earlier this year, and there were very, very few. So what you can see now is that even after New York Climate Week, which is when a new raft of them appeared, there still is an underwhelming, I think I would say, response to filing new NDCs. So only a third of the parties. Good news, though, at least those third of the parties represent about half of global emissions. It's not a third of the emissions. So glass half full on that, but still it's only half, so half empty. And what I want you to know is those are going to continue to come in. There's a Secretariat mandate report to synthesize them and inform the parties where they are in getting closer to achieving the Article 2 goals. That what you're going to see is different kind of NDCs come in. So for example, during the New York Climate Week, China pledged its one orally. I haven't yet seen the written version go up on the UNFCCC website. And what they did, as compared to the one I mentioned under the Biden administration, said, no, we're going to do a 7 to 10% reduction off a peak, what would have been peak emissions for us. Well, right away, you're going to say, well, a baseline that we can calculate from 2005 emissions is a different kind of measuring stick than a peak that is a theoretical number, right? The NDCs are, N is for nationally determined. And that's one of the challenges of this architecture, that each nation is empowered to define their contributions. So that's why we look at how are they measured up in total relative to Article 2. I think the last thing I want to leave on that before I take a quick turn, I'm trying to manage time. I think I have it. And I'll pick it up later in Q&A so I can have time to learn from Courtney with all of you. But what I want to make sure you understand is that NDC ambition is really important to the Brazilian presidency. There's a lot of activity going on there. There's a whole work program around mitigation, and also is making sure as a developing country presidency, even, although obviously an emerging economy, that adaptation is front and center. And so that is taking there's several agenda items on it, but the real one is what this thing is called the Global Goal on Adaptation. And that is under the Paris Agreement, which has a separate paragraph right on adaptation, but it says kind of a fuzzy language about there shall be a global goal on adaptation. And the question is, what should it be? Okay, so finally, turning to the last two slides, I want to make sure that, especially this audience, for those of us coming from the US, I think, especially without a strong national delegation being there. So in the past, we've, of course, always had executive branch staffed delegations, but we've also had many members of Congress and their staff also be present at COPs over the years. But what is going to be happening, I think, that will show US presentation, maybe more or most this year, is what's happening in this whole other sphere that takes place in the same area, in the blue zone, but it's called the Climate Action Agenda. Okay, what is that? So it's the area where we call them non-state actors, meaning they're not national governments, because only national governments have the ability, countries have the ability to enter treaties. States don't, provinces don't, cities don't, okay? That's just international law 101. But what's happened is in the Paris Agreement, in particular in the preamble, through a lot of activity leading up to it, that non-state actors have really made out their space for how they are working on this problem. Great example, municipal governments, big cities, organizations like C40. They can tell you how, of the member cities, how many greenhouse gases they represent, what kinds of building zones and, building codes, I should say, and heat requirements and cooling requirements that they can institute with their power at the state level to actually reduce the problem. So the other big actor in this space is the private sector. And the folks that you see on whatever, I guess it'll be the right for you on the slide, are what we call the global climate champions. Guy on the left is Danny Oshpe, and he's the COP30 climate champ. And what they do is they champion these non-country, in other words, subnational actors like cities and states and provinces and the private sector, and what they're doing in a voluntary way as non-adherence to the Paris Agreement. But what is evolving, and I'd like to go to the next slide for this and end here, is for me, having watched this for years. So Dan outed me. I'm a lawyer and a law professor. And so I really like things like laws and regulations to shape behavior. We got to get the norms in place so people will comply. But I like compliance and accountability. It's an occupational weakness. In the international level, there is no supra sheriff to enforce a lien or a judgment out of an international court when somebody doesn't live up to their treaty obligations. So it's all about political will, right? And the political will that happens at the national level bubbles up to their elected officials and keeps them on track. The other side is how we buy things. Okay, so we can say that the US is no longer the top greenhouse gas emitter in the country, but if you look at our per capita emissions, we're way above all the other countries. So there's a question of how we emit, and a lot of it is in our consumption patterns. So if you look at the private sector and their activity in this climate action agenda, you will see the most structured way I've seen in my 15 years of attending these COPs for treating the climate action agenda as an opportunity to actually achieve real reductions. I'll stop there because I think, Dan, I've pushed time. So I wasn't sure when you handed off to me, but I want to make sure Courtney has a chance for her time, and then I'll answer more of this or talk about it more in the Q&A.
Thanks, Tracy. That was a great presentation. I'm glad you mentioned C40 because we just had Kate Johnson from C40 on our podcast. The episode, I think, dropped yesterday or today. So listen to that if you want to learn a little bit more, or people in the audience are welcome to listen to that. Rate, review, subscribe to that podcast episode if you want to learn a little bit more about what C40 is planning for the next couple weeks. Tracy, you also had very detailed slides. As a reminder, slides, presentation materials, the webcast, everything will be archived pretty quickly, actually, on the webpage for the briefing, and you can access that at eesi.org. We'll also keep taking questions, so you are welcome. Well, Dano, can you put up the Mentimeter slide real quick? All right, Troy, would it be possible to put the slide up? There we go. Okay, so this is the QR code will take you to a Mentimeter. You can also go to menti.com and use the 8-digit code to ask a question. I'm going to pause here for just a second to give people time to do that. You could also ask us a question by sending us an email, and the email address to use is ask, that's ask@eesi.org. You can also follow us on social media at EESI Online. We will do our best to incorporate those questions from all sources into the Q&A that will happen in just a moment after our second speaker. So I'd like to introduce Courtney Durham Shane. Courtney is a senior officer for climate mitigation at the Pew Charitable Trusts. Courtney works on energy and conservation policy across sectors and political perspectives at the subnational, national, and international level in support of practical, durable solutions. Courtney's work at Pew includes authoring articles on protecting coastal wetlands and coral reefs in Central America and finding nature-based solutions to rebuilding economies affected by COVID-19. Before joining Pew, Courtney worked on global climate policy at the World Resources Institute, the Yale Center for Environmental Law and Policy, and the German Agency for International Cooperation. Courtney, it's always a delight to see you. Thank you as well for joining us during this very busy week. And I'm really looking forward to your presentation.
Thanks, Dan. Great to be here. Great to learn from Tracy. She did a great job with the level setting, the scene setting of what this whole COP process is and what countries are hoping to achieve. I am going to speak to you all on one of the bigger themes of this COP, which is going to be nature and climate. I work at the Pew Charitable Trust, as Dan says. This will be my 12th COP, so not quite as veteran as Tracy, but have definitely seen the circus that can be UNFCCC COPs over the years. So you see here in this title slide, that is the city of Belém, pronounced Belém in Portuguese. If you want to be totally appropriate with your pronunciations there, it sounds more like an N than an M. But as you can see, it is a place where nature meets built environment. It is a place where negotiators are descending or have descended upon to try and unlock what is one of the big global challenges of our time, climate change. COP30 was and still is, but really was positioned as a defining place and moment for nature and climate. You can imagine that with a Brazilian presidency using this COP to, let's say, demonstrate that nature and people are one and the same, that ecosystem protection, restoration, sustainable use, all of those things are core to climate ambition, and they wanted to, of course, showcase that as the president of this COP. So let's go over to the next slide. I'll tell you why nature matters for a few reasons. First and foremost, the Amazon location was very intentionally selected, right? They could have held this in Sao Paulo or Rio, which would have maybe eased some of the operational or logistics headlines that you may be reading, but Lula himself was quite adamant that this be held in the Amazon region, in the state of Pará. He wanted global negotiators, civil society, business leaders to be frankly reminded of the stakes, right? Every time that they walked through those venue doors, they would be in and around the Amazon when they are going to discuss things that have direct impacts on people and nature. So that was a very intentional selection. It definitely has had an impact on attendance, on accessibility, affordability, but the Brazilians stayed quite true to the need for this to be held in a location like that. That is just one of the pillars to help you understand why nature is so forefront at this COP. The other thing I would say is that nature-based solutions are the win-win. They are the twofer, right? This is a space where governments help meet both climate and biodiversity goals. They can be cost effective, right? They can be cheaper than a lot of the engineered alternatives. It is low-hanging fruit for governments trying to figure out what they do next on climate ambition. They can strengthen, they get a lot of ecosystem values that help people, right? You get food security, you get reduced disaster risk, you get jobs and livelihood. So that is what I mean by underpins all of these pillars of climate action. So it is a for lack of better word, like a fertile ground for action. And then because of that, it really is a place, as Tracy stressed, right? This COP is about implementation. I think the Brazilians have been quite clear that they're tired of just announcements and pledges and the upstream activities of we intend to do, and they're trying to make this COP be a place to demonstrate real practical solutions that countries have been implementing. And nature is one of those places, right? You can protect carbon sinks to keep emissions in the ground today. You can reforest relatively cheaply and quickly. So it's one of the easier steps, I would say, on the reducing emissions ladder, and it again has all of those benefits for people and nature. So I would have heralded this the nature COP from the beginning, and it seems like the Brazilians have really been hammering that throughout their presidency. So what is that going to look like on COP? We can go to the next slide here. It is going to look like a few things. First, there is this emphasis on the forests, right? It is going to be a focus on the Amazon largely, right? They are going to want to see it as the centerpiece. The presidency will talk about forest protections, but really about the money needed to do so, and I'll get to that later. They're going to talk about the integration, the role of Indigenous communities as protectors of those places. They're going to talk about sustainable livelihoods, just transition, as they say, being a key component of climate strategies. They are also going to talk about marine and the oceans. And for the first time ever, the World Leader Summit is going to have a session focused on ocean action. This is things like protecting carbon-rich habitats like coastal wetlands, but it's also things like engineered solutions, offshore wind, shipping decarbonization, other things that the Brazilians and other countries have been looking at quite closely over the last few years in terms of climate action. And then, of course, they're going to talk about people integrating Indigenous and community-led solutions into the COP process writ large. If we go through just real quick, the Amazon focus, I wanted to show, this is again a photo of Belém, right? This is the Amazon Riverway. You can see in the foreground with the skyline of Belém behind them. Again, this when you're reading headlines coming out of COP, I would expect a lot of it to focus on new commitments for Amazon finance and for just general tropical forest or other forest protections. Next slide. Marine ambitions. Again, like I said, we're expecting new announcements, but also finance, making it real. What is it going to take for countries to commit and actually implement their NDCs if they have marine focuses? There's a new body of research from World Resources Institute that said that over 40 countries of the 60 odd that have submitted their NDCs included marine policies or elements in their NDCs as a central focus of their climate ambition. So that has been a super growing space, and you see that the Brazilians are trying to elevate that further. And then lastly, we'll move over to the next slide, delivering for people. Again, this is they have long worked to incorporate better Indigenous community involvement in the COP process. There were there were promises of Lula and the Brazilian presidency shepherding this COP process alongside Brazilian Indigenous leaders. You see one here in the photo below with Lula. They've done a pretty good job of that and are looking to make sure that this is a COP that is fully representative of those being impacted by climate. So expect a lot on the Indigenous and local peoples, local communities front. Okay, next slide. So in the negotiations themselves, there's a few things that are going to be relevant to nature, right? There is this ongoing global goal on adaptation. We have long had a global goal on mitigation, right, which is the 2 degrees warming. Let's not pass that threshold. Let's strive for 1.5 degrees Celsius. But we had long punted what would be a global goal on adaptation because it was, frankly, I think a lot more difficult to quantify than the mitigation component of this work. So the Brazilians have inherited what is now the final negotiations on a global goal for adaptation. It is a complex process, again, because it has so many more qualitative components and is a little bit more of a vibes kind of goal than a hard science one. But it's expected, and you would hope that they can get this core negotiation stream completed by the end of this COP, and we'll see what is, the parity between mitigation and adaptation finally realized in the Paris Agreement with a decision between countries on what a global goal on adaptation is going to look like. Finance. Last year, countries settled on a new climate finance goal globally. This year, they are working on how to make that real. And so we'll see nature and all sorts of other ambitions coming to life with money talks, frankly. But expect nature to be cross-cutting in some of the finance conversations. And then the integration of nature in the NDCs. Tracy did a great job explaining that the NDCs are the force of the lifeblood of the Paris Agreement. Every country decides, what steps they want to take on climate action every 5 years. This is the 3rd round of these. And frankly, we are just way undersubscribed right now on NDC submissions. The latest number I saw was around 64 countries have submitted to date. That is supposed to be 195. So we are not where we need to be. I do hope that there's a flurry of submissions in the next few days ahead of the COP, as they're meant to be incorporated or get across the finish line from countries like the EU, a major emitter, and a few others. But I think this has been a real struggle and sticking point, and could be another major headline coming out of this COP is, where is the ambition? Where are the NDCs? Countries, this is the third round doing this. They know they need to do their homework, and participation is the point of this Paris Agreement. So trying to unlock a little bit more ambition from countries writ large. Okay, next slide. Expected announcements. I wanted to hover again on the Amazon. There is this thing that you will definitely hear about because the Brazilians have been almost centrally focused on this element of this COP, in addition to some of their negotiations responsibilities. It is called the TFFF, which stands for the Tropical Forest Forever Facility. Basically, this is a big new pot of money for keeping forests intact, right? Avoiding deforestation. Not just limited to the Amazon, but they wanted to be the inceptor of such a fund as a tropical forest country themselves. It is meant to be $125 billion in scale. $25 billion of that would come from public sources, so governments. The rest would come from private sector, multilateral development banks, others. This would be, I would say, the landmark, the key announcement, achievement of the Brazilian presidency, but one to for sure keep an eye out around headlines for this COP in nature. And then the other thing I'll mention is, again, countries decided on what was the finance goal last year in Azerbaijan, right? It was a goal that said that $300 billion annually would be dispersed, transferred from developed countries to developing countries, so public finance. But in addition, there would be this other more broad overarching finance goal of 1.3 trillion, a huge, huge number. $1.3 trillion annually would be transitioned for climate action if you also included not just developed countries to developing countries, but other developing countries in a position to do so, like China or some of the Gulf states. If you included the private sector, if you included the banks, if you think about what is real climate finance, the goal of this COP is to get some clarity around what that 1.3 trillion is, what counts, what wouldn't count, what is innovative, what is new and additional. This is an effort that the presidency has been undertaking. It's not necessarily a negotiated item. They are publishing it with the Azerbaijani presidency based on a lot of feedback from parties and other partners, but just wanted to flag that would also be a major component of this COP, is getting some clarity on like what really is climate finance and what counts. Okay, next slide. I wanted to bring a little bit of color to what is now potentially considered a split COP, right? You have Belém being the center of the negotiations themselves, but I think because of the operational woes, there has been an emphasis that other cities maybe host some of the other circus of events, right? So Sao Paulo is kind of being seen as like the finance and innovation hub in this week and next week. And Rio is really where you're seeing subnational governments and other civil society, philanthropy starting to show up and host a variety of events. Again, I think most would have wanted to be included in the normal COP circus, but frankly, the logistics did not lend themselves to something quite like that. Let's go to the next slide on subnats. Tracy spoke to this, but I just wanted to emphasize that there are quite a few governors and mayors around the world descending on Brazil this week and next. They will definitely be talking about nature and climate in addition to a lot of the other abatements that they're working on. This is a picture you see Mike Bloomberg shaking the hand of the COP president there. He's hosting the Local Leaders Summit in Rio, happening right now, that many of you should tune into if you can, being live streamed. But they're hoping to have a show of force, right? That in addition to national governments, all the other activities matter and do add up. This is a growing space in the UNFCCC. It's a space where the US has shown up increasingly over the years. I know there are several US governors, heads of energy agencies in different states, mayors, et cetera, all there right now, hoping to cut deals and learn from each other. There was an announcement of 100 US leaders. I don't know how the US CODEL numbers feature in that figure or not, but expected to be still a fairly prominent show of force and interest from US actors. And then you would see, we have seen things in the past like California cutting deals with China, MOUs of climate action together. So maybe you'll see some similar activities around this COP, noting that they're willing to step up to the plate. Okay, business and finance, my next slide here. I just wanted to say that there is still quite a flurry of activity around businesses and their interests and their intention to work on climate action in a way that is real. It is things like deforestation-free supply chains. It is things like carbon markets. You see actors like Microsoft and ExxonMobil and others that are in Brazil right now attending a variety of meetings and events to that extent. So just wanted to emphasize this fact that it's not just policymakers, it is businesses that see interest in this space as well. And then just to close out, this is really what Brazil's emphasis. Here's the venue that Tracy talked about. The real question is, can what happens there, right, actually permeate and matter across the world in real people's lives? And the Brazilians have been quite focused on how do we show that this has everyday implications for folks, right? It's not going to be just success is going to be judged by delivery, not just the ambition or the announcements, right? That the test will be whether finance reaches people and they're starting to see the alternative reality that has been described for so many years in their everyday lives. So we'll leave it to the Brazilians to hopefully get some of these answers across the line, but yeah, looking forward to the conversation and hearing what you all want to learn about. Thanks.
Thanks, Courtney. That was a great presentation. If anyone would like to go back and look at Courtney's slides, of course, everything is available at eesi.org. Courtney, you said something I want to start with a quick follow-up, and Tracy, you're obviously welcome to chime in with this as well. But Courtney, you were talking about finance moving from developed countries to developing countries. And you mentioned China as a developing country as the example that you cited. I think it might surprise some folks in our audience, maybe that China has that designation. Can you explain a little bit about where these definitions come from? Are they defined? Have they evolved over time? And why would China be considered a developing country when it's also talked about as one of, if not the major player at COP30 while the US is on the sidelines?
Great question. I will say that there is an exact definition of who is developed and developing in the UNFCCC framework, and it comes from a 1992 definition when this whole journey started. And so reality today, you're right, looks quite different about GDP growth or who might be, as they say, in a position to deploy capital to other countries. But China, some of the former Soviet states and the Gulf states are still considered developing based on that 1992 definition. I would say that they negotiate very hard to keep themselves on that list. They do not want to be considered and held liable for some of the same requirements of developed countries, which can be financial and rooted in transparency about what they have to report on emissions, et cetera. So I would posit that definition is very unlikely to change anytime soon. But you have seen in the agreements expand slightly in terms of Developed countries quite clearly have to do it. Others should do it, which is a nod towards that tension between, especially when you think about some of the Gulf states and others who have seen pretty extraordinary GDP growth in the last 2-3 decades and could be doing more of a fair share when it comes to climate finance.
Okay. And so developed would be like the United States, the EU, the UK, Canada,
exactly.
Australia, Japan.
Exactly. They use OECD definition from the time there. So there's a whole list that you can reference. They call themselves Annex 1, non-Annex 1, but you can find those annexes on the UNFCCC website.
Great. Tracy, do you have anything you'd like to offer in addition to what Courtney just explained on the?
No, but referencing the annexes, so they're annexes to the convention, so the UNFCCC, okay? And the Paris Agreement, one of the things it does is it argues for differentiation that's more nuanced because the annexes aren't to the Paris Agreement. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And then I think just more broadly, the UN uses developing and developed in a pretty fluid way. So that's what the parties are using now to argue that they don't have the same capacity or responsibility for emissions like an EU or the United States.
Okay, great. Well, let's turn our attention. Thank you both for your presentations. Let's turn to the Q&A, and the questions are coming in. Tracy, maybe we could stay with you for this first one and then give Courtney a chance to chime in as well. It's, I guess, pun intended, the elephant in the room, and that is the status of official U.S. engagement within the UNFCCC. What's the status of that, and what have you seen in your work over the past year monitoring the subsidiary bodies and the other activities that have gone on? What's that official U.S. presence actually look like since the new administration took over?
Diminished. I'll back that up. One, I mean, I think you're talking about how much we're engaging, but fundamentally, when the new administration came in, had an executive order that withdrew the United States formally from the Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement, not the UNFCCC. Remember that second slide with the 3 separate treaties. That means that within a year, under the terms of the Paris Agreement, the United States will exit it. So U.S. hasn't officially exited the Paris Agreement at this point, but I can tell you in Bonn, I took pictures of it for my students. There were U.S. placards in their usual space and nobody's sitting there. And then second, I think throughout the year, it's the leadership issue. You know, when I think of, for example, what's called the Enhanced Transparency Framework of the Paris Agreement, i.e. that BTR, the Biennial Transparency Reporting, which is a product of it, I think of the US and the Chinese negotiators who were the co-facilitators for that new way of making sure that we shine light on what countries are doing or not. That's not happening. In fact, I know where those people are these days, at least on the US side. They are not in the US government anymore. So I think that's a real issue, certainly on the climate action agenda. I mean, Bloomberg has done this before. What I always tell my students is that even since 1992, right, when the UNFCCC was adopted and George Bush the first, if you will, was in office at that time, and the U.S. was a leader and it ratified it pretty quickly. That was probably kind of a heyday in the sense of how the rest of the world can rely on the U.S. as a reliable partner on climate change. We have gone in and out, whether it's on the finance side or the actual mitigation commitments on our own. And so that's why I think we do tend to look at the action agenda, not only a lot on the subnational actors. That's why Gavin Newsom or any other governor of California is a big player in this space, as well as private businesses. The challenge there is it's all voluntary. Mm-hmm. And it's a little harder to monitor that. But what the interesting thing is, what that last slide I didn't get into, is how much of the commitments that non-state actors are making are in a similar form. They're kind of nationally or individually determined. They now have to report on it regularly. And at a certain point, they do something like a global stock take. So that rigor is being brought into it. The question will be if those actors actually live up to that.
Okay. So Courtney, I'd like to hear from you, if you would, like based on what Tracy just described, what has changed what's this changed role meant or will mean for the negotiations, and what are some dynamics that have changed, and specifically what other country, what other party to the convention might step up?
Yeah, it's pretty stark, to be honest with you. The US held a very robust role in these negotiations, right? They were able to be at times protagonists for bridging text, for running between delegations, for cutting deals in those 11th hours, as a real like broker of agreement between, just frankly because of the diplomatic force and savviness of our negotiators. They were also able to be antagonistic and push they had a louder voice, let's say, in some of these negotiations respective to other countries. And so what we're not seeing yet is an obvious filling of that role. There is a vacuum of power. And what is most likely happening right now without the US on the scene is you're starting to see a shift in climate diplomacy's like center of gravity away from Washington and potentially towards the EU, potentially towards China and other major emitters that are going to ideally step into the light. But so far it's been a very obvious vacuum of US leadership and diplomatic force helping to get some of these decisions, across the line.
I assume too, it's a challenge for the new presidency to figure out how to navigate that changed environment. The analogy I was thinking of sometimes is like, the role that Jupiter plays in the solar system, right? It's big enough that it collects all the flak from deep space and protects the little planets that are closer to the sun. Thanks for that. I really appreciate it. That question was probably the most popular one that was coming in, so I'm glad we get a chance to use that. This one, Courtney, maybe either one of you are welcome to jump in. You know how this works. But for our audience, a congressional staff audience, they have a lot going on. They have a lot of bandwidth. From a federal policy perspective, without a US federal presence there, with all of the different dynamics that Courtney just described, why should federal policymakers be paying attention to COP30? I know we're reading reports today about maybe some of the congressional delegations not being able to go because of the lapse in appropriations. Where do we derive relevancy for a federal policymaker audience? In particular, congressional staff will be following this from their desks here in DC.
I think there's still obviously a role for American policymaking. Right now, it has just shifted towards the subnats, right? The subnational and local leaders. There's also interest and deep commitment from American businesses, right? They still see this as central to their bottom lines, to their risk strategies, to their expansion and growth like outlooks. Is how are rules and norms being set from governments going to impact global markets? What does it mean for their future business models? So maybe just a different focus than normal, but still plenty of opportunity and implications for US federal policymakers to take maybe some insights from how other governments are approaching this and what they need to be thinking about next.
Tracy, what do you think? What kind of outcomes might federal policymakers be especially concerned with, even if maybe they don't realize it right now?
Well, I do think it comes back to competition, right? And if the current administration is true to its rhetoric, not engaging in this is holding U.S. business back. There's plenty of information now about China being the lead in both solar energy production and electric vehicles. And that's not something that came out of nowhere. That's because the US did not ratify the Kyoto Protocol. And China had this opportunity under the protocol to develop with the investments from European countries. So the sense of allyship there is fairly natural, but it also gave China the policy basis that then created the reality basis that now fuels demand. And when we look at demand for whether it's solar energy or EVs or other things, I mean, it's there. And so business leaders already are on that. And a lot of the literature, well, here, I'm teaching MBA students, and they all want to come to this COP. And they I'm part of the being a chief sustainability officer, a CSO. There's definitely retrenchment in the C-suites right now on sustainability. But one of the alums I was talking to not long ago said that's because all that supply chain focus that Courtney pointed out, right? That is part of their DNA now. They're already doing that, and that drives down the unit cost. So then it's the why not. And if the consumer keeps demanding it, then it's the why. I said this before the call. I've lived here a long time in the United States. We snoozed and we lost under the Kyoto Protocol, in my humble opinion, and we're doing it again. We're shooting ourselves in the foot. And I think Europe does lead on this because they've got an electorate, for the most part, that's really looking at the impact not only on them, but their children and their grandchildren. And they're not trying to deny the problem.
I would have let you said you snoozed, you losed. I would have allowed that. I wouldn't have objected with that.
Okay, well, I just had to, grammar.
Yeah, exactly. We wouldn't want anyone to use incorrect grammar on any EESI briefing. We have time for a couple questions. I want to sort of look a little bit future, but before that, a lot of stuff have come up. Courtney in particular did a great job highlighting sort of the focus of the COP, the forests, some of the indigenous communities and all that. Tracy, is there something that hasn't come up yet that you think, an issue that you think will get relatively more attention at COP30 than maybe it's received in past COPs?
That's a great question. I think Courtney hit it. I mean, it's the tropical forest as part of forestation. I guess we could say related to ag, because there's always that good, healthy tension between the two. I think health, has been getting increasingly highlighted on the agenda. You've got WHO and the Lancet and all kinds of medical schools there. And I guess I'm going to make this last pitch about the climate action agenda. One of the things that impresses me that I've never seen in this space since 2015, so in the last 10 years, is that the climate champ for Brazil went in with his team and said, okay, what Courtney, you were saying earlier about all these declarations and things that happen that, don't have an accountability built into them, right? And so they went through and they found 600 of these that had accumulated. I think of them as detritus, right, over the years. Well, it turns out 300 of them were still going because they had stakeholders built in at the national level. So they said, okay, we're going to ignore those other 300. Like, that's a discipline right there. And they said, now we're going to focus on how those 300 fit into the global stocktake findings. So they've been very purposeful. And now within that, they have, 30 groups, I think? They're called activation groups. And they each have very specific goals where the stakeholders in those 300 active initiatives are working to get together to come up with practical solutions. And I'm getting a chance to see this firsthand because of one of the companies my MBA students at Tucker was working with. So I'm pretty bullish on it, even though I said I'm a regulatory gal. I like my calls.
Courtney, is there an issue that hasn't come up yet? I'm glad Tracy mentioned agriculture. I feel like that was one that I heard a lot about last year, but is there another issue that you want to just mention?
I'd mentioned two here in the remaining minutes. So we have rightfully focused on carbon and decarbonization as the space for action, but clearly interests from China and others surround the non-carbon greenhouse gas emissions. So methane is going to be a big one. Some of the other, we call them super pollutants, are going to be central to a lot of the conversation. And then the other thing is, by this time, you would have normally known who the next COP president would be, which country inherits the 2026 negotiations. But we have been at an impasse with dueling bids from Australia and Turkey for many, many months now, with no real clarity. It's frankly a toss-up about who is meant to be the next COP president. If they do not settle and agree unanimously to a bid by the end of this COP, so by November 21st, 22nd, then it will default to being held in Bonn, Germany, where the UNFCCC Secretariat is located under a sort of a shared agreement. So a lot to look out for in terms of if one of those countries is successful, because that also will influence how, the trajectory of ambition and themes that the next presidency wants to pick up and carry forward.
Right. There was some controversy with that in the lead up to Azerbaijan being selected. I think there was some scuttlebutt at the time about maybe resorting to Bonn or defaulting to Bonn.
Yes,
Yeah.
we've seen it in the past. Not often. You normally see some concessions and other pawn trading happen so that there's a clear winner. But I couldn't tell you right now who is going to come across the finish line with the 2026 venue.
Great. Well, we'll keep an eye out for that. That'll be something that we keep an eye out for. Courtney and Tracy, thank you so much for your great presentations and answering all of our questions today. Thank you so much for joining us. It is always great to see you. Tracy, you'll be traveling to Belém, but Courtney will not be. So we'll look forward to learning about how this goes after the fact from your experiences over the next couple of weeks. I know it's an intensive effort here. I'm sure it's also a very intensive effort at for you and your respective organizations. So thank you so much. I'd also like to take a moment to thank my colleagues who helped pull the briefing together today. Dan O, Amory, Allison, Hannah, Anna, Nicole, Laura, and Miguel. Thank you all. Haley and Olivia are our interns this semester, and they're great. And we also have Troy, the videographer, who got a name check earlier. And so he doesn't always get that, but he always gets thanked because without his videography skills, we wouldn't be able to do this quite as well. This is a survey, a link to a survey. If you have any comments about the briefing today, if you have any feedback, or if you had any AV issues, or if you like the Mentimeter, or you have suggestions to help improve that, we'd really appreciate every response that we get. We read every response and we appreciate all the feedback. We have a lot of COP30 resources coming up. And tomorrow, I hope to see everyone online for our second briefing in this 3-part series. Tomorrow will be about the global cooling pledge, which will be something that didn't come up much today, but it will be a big topic of discussion. And to Courtney's point about non-carbon emissions, hydrofluorocarbons and other pollutants and things like that, obviously will come into play. We have a great panel tomorrow. And then on Thursday, we're having a very interesting discussion at international trade and climate policy, something that is very much in the news here in the United States, but also elsewhere around the world, and what some of those dynamics might mean for the negotiations. We also will be publishing an issue later this week of our newsletter COP30 Dispatch that will recap some of the events taking place in Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. And then next week, that newsletter will kick into high gear, and we will be publishing updates on a daily basis, curated for a congressional staff audience. If you're a congressional staff person, you will also be hearing from us about some staff-only opportunities to keep up with the negotiations as well. And in the newsletter, in COP30 Dispatch, which you can subscribe to by visiting us online at eesi.org, you also have contact information for us. If you have any specific questions that come up during the negotiations, you're always welcome to contact me or my colleague Anna or anyone else here at EESI. And if we can't find the answer, or if we can't answer your question, we might be able to find someone who could, and we can help you with that. We also, I don't think this has been published. We'll also be doing one of our patented rapid readout briefings after COP30, the week of Thanksgiving, but not, I think it's the Tuesday before Thanksgiving. And that will be a great opportunity to kind of in a 30-minute time frame, understand some of the top line issues or headlines that came out of COP30. Thank you to Courtney and Tracy. Thanks to everyone in our online audience today for joining us. We'll be back here tomorrow, noon Eastern, for a discussion about the global cooling pledge. Hope to see everybody back. And don't forget to subscribe to COP30 Dispatch. It's going to be a great resource. So thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your Tuesday. We'll see you tomorrow.